The engine roared to life. $95,000 of green metal and precision engineering silent for 19 days, suddenly alive again in the middle of a Tennessee field. But the machine did not move. Marcus Drake stood watching through the cab window as the 71-year-old man sat perfectly still at the controls, hands resting on mechanisms Marcus did not understand, waiting for something only he seemed to know was coming. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Behind Marcus, his foreman James Cooper held his breath, eyes fixed on the tractor that had become the center of every conversation, every calculation, every sleepless night for the past 3 weeks. His wife Sarah's hands were clasped so tight, her knuckles went white, pressed against her chest, as if holding something precious and fragile. The ranch hands along the fence had already started turning away, shoulders slumping, done, watching another failure in a long sequence of expensive disappointments. But the old man in that cab did not move, did not lose his composure, did not reach for tools, or make excuses, or show any sign of the panic that had consumed everyone else who had tried to solve this problem. He just sat there, waiting for some principle of hydraulics and patience that modern technology had forgotten how to measure. Then, without warning, the massive machine lurched forward. Slow at first, hesitant like something remembering how to breathe after being underwater too long. Then stronger, more certain. The rear tires, each one taller than a man, gripped Tennessee soil with the authority of proper function restored, and the tractor rolled across the field smooth and powerful, cutting clean tracks through earth that had been waiting like it had never been broken at all. What happened in those 30 seconds would change everything Marcus Drake believed about success, expertise, and where real knowledge actually lives. But to understand that moment, to truly comprehend the weight of what shifted in those silent seconds of waiting, you have to go back. Back to where this story really begins. Back to the morning when a 62-year-old man's entire system for navigating the world started to collapse and he did not even know it yet. The sun cleared the eastern ridge at 6:43 on a Tuesday morning in October, casting long shadows across the 1,200 acres of bottomland that Marcus Drake had purchased 5 years ago for reasons even he did not fully understand at the time. The $95,000 John Deere 9R Series tractor sat motionless in the center of the main field, exactly where it had been sitting for the past 18 days. Green metal and engineering that should have been halfway through the harvest by now, working 16-hour days to bring in the soybeans before the weather turned and the narrow window of optimal conditions closed forever. Instead, it sat like a monument to everything slipping sideways, a very expensive reminder that money and determination could not solve every problem that presented itself. Marcus stood near the red barn, dressed in a pressed jacket over flannel, because even on his own land, even when facing a crisis that threatened to unravel years of careful planning, he wore the uniform of control. 62 years old, silver hair going white at the temples in a way that Sarah said made him look distinguished, the particular posture of a man who had spent 3 decades solving problems by identifying them clearly, hiring the right expert to address them, and writing the check they asked for. That system had built him a commercial real estate empire in Nashville that stretched across 3 states, bought distressed properties when everyone else was selling, when the market was in free fall, and conventional wisdom said to hold cash and wait, held through the crashes that made weaker men panic and sell at the bottom, sold at the peaks when everyone else was buying, convinced the good times would last forever, made enough money that he never had to think about money again, at least not in the way most people did, worrying about bills and retirement and whether they could afford the things they wanted. Then 5 years ago he bought this land, not as a retirement dream, not as a hobby to fill the hours after the real work was done, not as a gentleman's farm where he could play at agriculture while the real farmers did the actual work, as a business, as proof that Marcus Drake could succeed in a world completely outside his expertise, that the principles he had used to build his real estate empire could translate to any industry if you were smart enough and determined enough and willing to pay for the best advice. The previous owner, a man named Henderson, who had worked this land for 40 years, had called it foolish. A city businessman playing at farming, he had said, with the particular condescension that people who work with their hands sometimes show for people who work with their minds. Marcus had smiled and written the check anyway because Marcus Drake did not fail at things he set his mind to. He hired the right people. He built the right systems. He executed with precision and discipline. Except right now, standing in the cold October morning with his breath visible in the air and the tractor sitting silent and uncooperative in his field, his most critical piece of equipment was doing nothing at all. 19 days. 19 days of silence in the wrong season when every hour mattered and the calendar kept moving, whether the machine cooperated or not. The harvest window was closing with the inexorable certainty of weather patterns and crop maturation cycles that cared nothing for human schedules or financial obligations. The weather was turning, cold fronts moving down from the north, bringing the kind of early freeze that could destroy a season's work in a single night. And behind all of that, behind the immediate crisis of crops rotting in the field and equipment failing and seasons passing, sat a deadline Marcus had not shared with anyone except his banker: the loan. The expansion loan he had taken against the property 6 months ago to acquire the neighboring 300 acres from the Henderson family, the same family whose patriarch had warned him about city boys playing farmer. Due in 42 days. The payment required selling this harvest at projected yields that assumed optimal weather and timely harvesting and equipment that actually worked when you needed it to work. Without that income, the numbers did not work. Without those numbers, Marcus would have to sell assets to cover the payment. The Nashville properties he had sworn never to touch the foundation of everything he had built, the legacy he planned to leave for Emma. He had not told Sarah about the loan, had not told Emma about the expansion or the risk or the deadline that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, doing calculations that always came out the same way. Had barely admitted it to himself in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep would not come and the weight of it pressed against his chest like something physical and heavy. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, the vibration loud in the quiet morning. James Cooper's name on the screen. The foreman never called this early unless something was wrong, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten even before he answered, some part of him knowing that the news would not be good, because good news never came at this hour. "Tell me." "Boss, we got a problem." James's voice carried that careful steadiness of a man who knew his employer did not appreciate panic or drama, who had learned over 5 years of working together that Marcus Drake wanted facts delivered cleanly and solutions proposed immediately. The deer fired up about an hour ago, ran smooth for maybe 90 seconds, sounded perfect actually. Then it just quit. Won't restart now. I've tried everything I know. Marcus closed his eyes, one hand gripping the barn door frame hard enough that the wood pressed lines into his palm. "I'm on my way." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, letting the cold October air fill his lungs, trying to find the calm center that had served him through 3 decades of business crises and market crashes and deals that went sideways. This was solvable. Everything was solvable. You just had to find the right person with the right expertise and pay them what they were worth. That was how the world worked. That was how Marcus Drake had won at everything else he had ever attempted. It would work here too. It had to. Because the alternative, the possibility that his system might fail him, that money and expertise and determination might not be enough, was something he could not allow himself to consider. Not now. Not with 42 days on the clock and everything he had built potentially hanging in the balance. Christopher Clark arrived that afternoon in a service truck, carrying enough diagnostic equipment to test a spacecraft. 45 years old, certified by John Deere, with 20 years of experience and a reputation across 3 counties for solving problems other technicians could not crack. He wore confidence, like a second skin, the easy assurance of someone who had seen every failure mode a machine could produce and knew exactly how to address each one. Marcus had found him through a contact in Nashville who owned farm equipment dealerships, who had said if anyone could fix this, Christopher could, and that recommendation had been enough for Marcus to call immediately and offer double the standard rate to get him out here today. Marcus watched from the barn as Christopher spent 3 hours under the hood checking circuits and testing components with equipment that beeped and clicked and displayed readings Marcus could not interpret, but assumed meant something significant to someone with the right training. The afternoon stretched long and cold shadows lengthening across the field as the sun tracked west. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that would arrive tonight, whether anyone was ready or not, whether crops were harvested or rotting in the field. Christopher replaced 2 modules working with the methodical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Rewired a connection that he said looked corroded, though it had looked fine to Marcus's untrained eye. Ran diagnostics that all came back clean, every test showing green lights and optimal readings, and absolutely no indication of what might be wrong. The bill would be $1,850 for parts and labor. The tractor still would not move. Christopher stood beside the machine with his hands on his hips, staring at the engine bay, as if it had personally betrayed him, as if the machine had violated some fundamental agreement between technician and technology. "I'll come back tomorrow with different parts. Sometimes these control modules are defective straight from the factory, pass all the tests, but fail under actual load. Seen it before with the 9R series. Marcus kept his voice level, that careful control he had learned in 1,000 business negotiations, where showing emotion was weakness and weakness was expensive. You're telling me you don't know what's wrong. I'm telling you, the diagnostic says everything's fine, but clearly everything's not fine. The numbers don't match the behavior, which means there's something the system isn't detecting. Give me another day with fresh modules and I'll track it down. Christopher returned the next morning with a case full of components and the same confident expression, the same certainty that this time he would find the answer. He worked for 5 hours while Marcus tried to focus on other ranch business, but found himself checking the field every 20 minutes, watching Christopher's methodical progress. Replaced parts, ran tests, consulted manuals thick enough to break a man's foot if you drop them, technical specifications that reduced the machine to diagrams and numbers and logical systems. The new parts cost $950, priority shipped from a distributor in Memphis. The tractor remained exactly as immobile as before, sitting in the field like a very expensive paperweight. The technician climbed down from the cab with his confidence starting to fracture around the edges, uncertainty bleeding through the professional exterior like water through a cracked dam. Mr. Drake, I'm stumped. This should be working. Everything tests perfect. The engine runs clean. The hydraulics show proper pressure. The transmission engages. But something in the chain isn't translating power to the wheels, and I cannot for the life of me figure out what. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not quite fear, but adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of a man who had always been able to buy his way out of problems, discovering that maybe this time money was not enough. So what do I do? Honestly, you might want to get a second opinion. Sometimes fresh eyes catch what I'm missing. I've been staring at this thing so long I might be overlooking something obvious. Marcus wrote the check $2,800 for 2 days of failure and watched Christopher drive away with the same confidence he had arrived with, now replaced by the confusion of an expert encountering the limits of his expertise. The tractor sat silent. The clouds grew heavier. The harvest was now 5 days behind schedule and falling further back with every hour that passed, with every diagnostic that came back clean while the machine refused to move. That evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table while Sarah moved through the familiar rhythm of making dinner, a routine they had performed together for 32 years of marriage. Cutting vegetables with the efficiency of long practice, setting water to boil for pasta. The house smelled like onions and garlic, and the particular comfort of home at the end of a difficult day, smells that normally would have relaxed Marcus, but tonight only reminded him of everything that was slipping out of his control. She did not ask about the tractor because she already knew from the set of his shoulders, from the way he held his coffee cup, from 32 years of reading his moods, what the answer would be. Their daughter Emma's face appeared on Marcus's phone screen during dinner, the video call interrupting the quiet meal. Cheerful and oblivious to the weight pressing down on her father's chest, calling from her apartment in Atlanta, where she worked in marketing for a firm that kept trying to promote her into management she did not want. "Dad, how's the harvest going?" Marcus forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. That probably did not fool Emma, but was the best he could manage under the circumstances. "Small hiccup, nothing serious. Just some equipment maintenance taking longer than expected." You look tired. Long day. How's work going? That campaign you were telling me about last week. Emma talked about her job, about a campaign she was managing for a major client, about the usual chaos of her professional life that seemed so distant from the immediate crisis of crops and machines and deadlines. Marcus half listened, making the appropriate sounds at the appropriate moments, while his mind circled back to the machine sitting dead in his field, to the loan payment in 40 days, to the reality that his system for solving problems was not working the way it always had before. When the call ended, Sarah put her hand on his across the table, her touch gentle but firm. You'll figure it out. Will I? You always do. You're the most resourceful person I know. But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them, and Marcus could tell from her eyes that she knew it too. 3 days lost to a problem that should have been simple. 5 days total behind schedule. The problem no closer to solved. And in his head a countdown he could not stop, could not slow down, could not negotiate with the way he negotiated with people and markets and business problems. 39 days until the loan payment came due. 39 days to solve this harvest, the crops, sell them at the yields he had projected, and save everything he had built. Marcus went to bed past midnight after hours of staring at spreadsheets and weather forecasts and market prices, trying to find some combination of variables that made the numbers work, even if the harvest was delayed another week, another 2 weeks. But sleep would not come, his mind churning through scenarios and possibilities, and the uncomfortable recognition that maybe this time determination and money were not enough. Daniel Martinez came highly recommended from Memphis, a contact of a contact, who said if Christopher Clark could not fix it, Daniel could, that Daniel was the best diagnostic technician in the state. 38 years old with a master technician certification and equipment that made Christopher's setup look basic, like comparing a smartphone to a telegraph. He arrived on day 4, carrying confidence and the assurance of someone who had solved worse problems than this, who had seen machines fail in ways that defied logic and had still found the answers. He ran a complete diagnostic scan that took 2 hours and generated reports dense with technical language. Marcus pretended to understand, nodding at appropriate moments while Daniel pointed to graphs and numbers and explained what they meant in a way that assumed Marcus had more technical knowledge than he actually possessed. Hydraulic system failure, Daniel announced with the certainty of a doctor reading X-rays, his finger tracing lines on the diagnostic report. Specifically, you've got a pressure drop somewhere between the pump and the drive actuators. I can fix this. He ordered parts from a dealer 2 counties over, components with names Marcus did not recognize, technical specifications that meant nothing to him, but apparently meant everything to solving the problem. Priority shipping because every day mattered. The cost $3,200 just for parts, not including labor. Marcus signed off on the expense without hesitation, because this was what success cost, what solving problems required. Finding the right expert, trusting their judgment, paying what they asked. This was the system. This was how the world worked when you operated at a certain level. The parts arrived on schedule, delivered by a truck that seemed too large for the small boxes it carried. Daniel installed them with meticulous care, every connection checked twice, every seal properly torqued to manufacturer specifications, every step documented in a way that would have impressed any quality control inspector. He was methodical and professional and gave every impression of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who had done this exact procedure dozens of times before. When he finished, he ran the diagnostic again, waiting for the confirmation that the repair had worked. All systems showed green. Every test came back optimal. The pressure readings were exactly where they should be. He climbed into the cab with the air of a man who had earned his confidence through years of successful repairs, who had every reason to believe this time would be no different. Started the engine, which turned over immediately, that deep rumble of a diesel firing on all cylinders. Nothing changed. The tractor sat perfectly still, engine running, strong systems, showing optimal across the board, but absolutely no movement in the drivetrain, no power transferring to the wheels, no response to the controls that should have sent this machine rolling across the field. Daniel climbed down, confusion replacing confidence, and ran the scan a third time, looking for what he had missed. Convinced that something in the installation must have been wrong, even though he had checked everything twice, had followed the procedure exactly. The diagnostic came back clean again. Perfect readings, optimal function, everything working exactly as it should, except for the fundamental reality that the machine would not move. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, the cold wind cutting through his jacket, watching the third expert in 6 days struggle with a problem that should have been simple. Explain it to me. The parts are all new, installed correctly. The pressure's reading correct across all sensors. Everything tests perfectly. The system shows no faults. Daniel's voice had lost its certainty, had taken on the frustrated tone of someone encountering something that should not be possible according to everything he knew. But the machine won't engage. The drivetrain shows no response to input, even though the hydraulic pressure is reaching it. They spent another full day together, Daniel checking the transmission, while Marcus tried not to watch the calendar, tried not to calculate how much this delay was costing him per hour per day. 11 days now. 11 days of standing still while the season moved forward without him, while weather patterns shifted and optimal harvesting windows closed, and the loan payment deadline grew closer. On the morning of day 12, Daniel approached Marcus with the expression of a man delivering news. He wished he could avoid news that went against his professional pride and his belief in his own abilities. He had been up half the night reviewing technical manuals, calling colleagues, searching online forums for anyone who had encountered this specific combination of symptoms. Mr. Drake, I hate to say this, but the repair cost is going to exceed the replacement value if we keep going down this path. My professional recommendation is to scrap it and buy new. Marcus's throat went tight, his breath catching for just a moment. It's 14 months old, barely used. I know, and I can't explain it. Sometimes machines just fail catastrophically for reasons we can't identify. There's no pattern, no warning signs, no logical progression, just bad luck and bad timing. Daniel looked genuinely troubled, as if this failure reflected on him personally. I've never seen anything quite like this. Everything tests perfect, but it won't perform. If it were my money, I'd cut my losses before I spend another $5,000 trying to chase a ghost. Daniel Martinez drove away with a check for $4,800 and the problem no closer to solved, leaving Marcus standing alone in the field with his most expensive piece of equipment still silent and uncooperative. Marcus stood there as the sun set, both hands pressed against the cold metal of the machine, and felt something inside him start to crack. Not breaking yet, but fracturing stress lines, forming in the foundation of certainty he had built his life upon. This was not about the money anymore. Though the money mattered, though every dollar spent on failed repairs was a dollar that could not be used elsewhere. This was about the fact that his system was not working. The equation that had governed his entire adult life, find the right expert, pay them well, trust their expertise, get results, was broken. And he did not know how to fix what he did not understand, could not even properly diagnose, because he lacked the technical knowledge to evaluate whether these experts were actually experts or just expensive guesses dressed up in confident language and fancy equipment. That weekend, Emma drove up from Atlanta without calling ahead the 2.5-hour drive from her apartment, made on impulse after a phone call with her mother that revealed more than Sarah had probably intended to share. She arrived Saturday morning with coffee from Marcus's favorite shop in Nashville, having driven 40 minutes out of her way to get it, and that radar daughters develop for knowing when their fathers are drowning in problems they will not admit to. She found Marcus in the barn, staring at maintenance logs as if they might reveal some pattern he had previously missed, some combination of service dates and repairs that would suddenly make sense of why this machine had failed so catastrophically and so mysteriously. "Dad." He looked up from the logs, trying to arrange his face into something resembling confidence, the mask he usually wore so easily, but now felt heavy and ill-fitting. "Sweetheart, didn't know you were coming. This is a nice surprise. Mom called me." She said it gently but directly, not willing to pretend this was a casual visit when they both knew better. Of course she had. Sarah had probably been more worried than she let on, had probably seen deeper into Marcus's crisis than he realized, had probably called Emma out of concern that went beyond a broken tractor. Emma sat down on a hay bale and waited with that particular kind of patience that made people confess things they had planned to keep hidden. The same patience Sarah had, the same ability to create space for truth by simply being present without judgment. Marcus put down the logs, accepting that this conversation was going to happen whether he was ready for it or not. "The tractor's still dead. I figured. Mom says you've had 3 mechanics out here. 2, about to call a 3rd. Though even as he said it, Marcus felt the futility of it, the sense that calling another expert would just result in another expensive failure, another confident diagnosis, followed by another incomprehensible outcome. Emma took a sip of coffee, considering her next words with the care she brought to difficult conversations. "What does James think?" Marcus felt his defenses rising automatically, that instinctive resistance to advice from people without the right credentials, without the letters after their names and the certifications on their walls. "James is a good foreman, excellent at his job. But this is a technical problem, complex machinery. It needs someone with the right training and equipment, someone who understands these systems at a level James doesn't." "Dad." Emma's voice was gentle but firm, carrying that particular blend of love and exasperation that only children can bring to conversations with their parents. "You taught me to trust data. You drilled it into me my whole childhood. Facts matter, results matter. The data says 2 certified experts can't fix this. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. The suggestion landed like criticism, even though her voice carried no judgment, no implied superiority. Marcus stood needing to move, needing to feel like he was doing something instead of just absorbing advice he did not want that contradicted everything he believed about how to solve problems. What different approach? Hire a 4th mechanic, a 5th keep throwing money at it until someone gets lucky. That's not a system, that's just hope dressed up as strategy. Emma stood facing him with Sarah's steady eyes and his own stubborn chin, the combination of traits that made her both like him and able to stand up to him in ways most people could not. What's the worst that could happen at this point? You're already being told to scrap it. The machinery's useless if it doesn't work. At least try something different before you give up completely. The words hit harder than Marcus expected, partially because she was right, and partially because giving up was something Marcus Drake did not do, had never done, had built his entire identity around not doing. He turned away, staring out the barn door at the field where the harvest should have been happening, where equipment should have been moving, and crops should have been coming in, and money should have been accumulating to pay the loan that Emma knew nothing about. Emma came to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his, both of them looking out at the same field but seeing different things. You know what I think? I think you're scared. Not of losing the money, though, I know that matters. You're scared that the way you've done everything your whole life might not work anymore. That the system you built your success on might have limits you never had to face before. Marcus's jaw clenched, muscles working beneath the skin, but he did not argue because the statement was too close to truth, too accurate to dismiss with platitudes or deflection. Emma put her hand on his arm, her touch gentle. Sometimes the answer's not in the obvious place, Dad. Sometimes you have to look where it's uncomfortable, where it challenges what you believe about how things should work. She stayed through lunch talking with Sarah about Atlanta and work and life, carefully avoiding the subject of the tractor, except in the most general terms, giving Marcus space to think without pressure. When she left that afternoon, Marcus stood on the porch, watching her drive away, watching until her car disappeared down the long gravel drive. The seed she had planted began very slowly to take root. What Marcus did not know yet, what he could not have known standing there on his porch with 31 days left until the loan payment came due and his entire system for solving problems collapsing around him, was that the answer he needed was already waiting 12 miles down County Road 7. It had been waiting the whole time, patient and certain, in the hands of a man who understood machines in ways that had nothing to do with computers or certifications or expensive diagnostic equipment. He just had not been ready to see it, had not been humble enough, desperate enough, broken enough to look in the places Emma was suggesting. But he was getting there. Patricia Anderson cost $500 just to show up, her consultation fee non-negotiable and worth it according to everyone Marcus had spoken to, but her reputation was ironclad across 4 states. If Patricia could not fix it, it could not be fixed. That was what people said, what the online reviews claimed, what his contacts in Nashville swore was true. 50 years old independent specialist, 25 years of experience. that showed in the methodical way she approached every problem, in the way she asked questions before even looking at the machine. Marcus called her on Monday morning, day 12, with the kind of desperation he had spent his entire life avoiding the admission of weakness he had always viewed as failure. She arrived that afternoon with a tablet computer and diagnostic software that made Daniel Martinez's equipment look like toys, like relics from an earlier era of technology. The software alone had cost $15,000 according to her website, constantly updated with manufacturer data and failure mode databases and AI-assisted pattern recognition. Marcus stood back and let her work, no longer trusting his own judgment about who could solve this, no longer confident that his ability to identify expertise was as reliable as he had always believed. Patricia spent 5 hours checking every system with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, cross-referencing data from one sensor against readings from another, running tests that generated reports thick enough to bind into a book, comprehensive enough to satisfy any engineering review. She checked the electrical system for shorts and weak connections, the hydraulic system for leaks and pressure inconsistencies, the transmission for gear wear and alignment issues, the computer systems for corrupted code and faulty sensors. Every single test came back clean, showed optimal function, revealed absolutely nothing wrong with any component or subsystem. She stood beside the tractor as the sun began to set, staring at her tablet screen with an expression Marcus could not quite read. Something between confusion and professional curiosity, as if the machine had presented her with a puzzle she found intellectually interesting, even as it defied solution. "Mr. Drake." She did not look up from the screen, her eyes scanning data streams and comparison charts. "Technically, according to every measurement I can take, this machine should be running perfectly. But it's not. No, it's not." She finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "And I can't tell you why based on what my equipment can detect." She ran the diagnostics again, triple-checking readings that refused to make sense, that showed a perfectly functioning machine that somehow did not function. Marcus felt something like desperation starting to build in his chest, the sensation of ground shifting under his feet, of certainty crumbling into sand. What does that mean? What do I do next? Patricia closed her tablet and looked at him directly, honest in a way the others had not been willing to admit the limits of her expertise, rather than making confident promises she could not keep. "It means there's something wrong that our diagnostic systems can't detect. Either it's buried so deep in the architecture that we'd have to dismantle the entire machine component by component, which would cost more than buying new, or it's something so simple, so basic that we're all missing it because we're looking for complex failures that match our complex tools." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "In my experience, when you get this combination of symptoms, perfect diagnostics with failed performance, the problem is usually in a place nobody thinks to check. A mechanical failure so fundamental that it predates electronic monitoring. But I don't know what that place is in this case. I'm sorry." She refused to charge for the diagnostic time beyond the initial consultation fee, a gesture of professional integrity that somehow made Marcus feel worse rather than better. The privilege of hearing an expert admit defeat cost him $500. Patricia Anderson drove away, and Marcus stood in the gathering darkness, watching her taillights disappear down the county road, watching the last of the daylight fade from the western sky. 14 days. $7,600 spent. 3 certified professionals with decades of combined experience in equipment designed to diagnose problems a human could never detect on their own. And not one of them could tell him what was wrong, what to fix, how to move forward. Marcus walked to the center of the field where the tractor sat, the ground soft beneath his feet from recent rain. He put both hands on the cold metal and felt the first real crack in his composure, felt the careful control he had maintained for 3 decades start to fracture. This was not about the money anymore, though $7,600 was not nothing even for a man with resources. It was not even about the harvest, though. Every day of delay cost him thousands in lost revenue and increased risk. This was about the fact that he could not fix this problem by doing what he had always done. The equation that had governed his entire adult life, the formula he had relied on through every challenge and crisis, was broken. Find the best expert available. Pay them what they ask. Trust their expertise. Get results. Except the results were not coming. The experts were failing. And Marcus did not know what came next because he had never had to think about what came next, had never encountered a problem that resisted this approach. And he did not know what came after, what alternative approach existed, how to navigate a world where money and credentials did not guarantee solutions. That night Marcus could not sleep. He got up at 2 in the morning and stood at the bedroom window looking out at nothing, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. Sarah woke when she felt him leave the bed, that married person awareness of absence, even in sleep. "Talk to me." Marcus's shoulders sagged, the careful posture of control finally giving way to exhaustion and fear and confusion. What if they're all wrong? What if I'm approaching this completely wrong? What if the problem isn't the machine at all, but the way I'm trying to fix it? Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his cold ones. "What does James think?" "James manages the farm." The defensive response came automatically, that instinctive protection of his worldview. "This needs an expert with specialized knowledge." James has been around machines his whole life. His father was a mechanic. He grew up fixing equipment. Marcus pulled his hand away, that reflexive rejection of advice that contradicted his system. "This is a $95,000 piece of equipment with computerized systems and hydraulics that require specific technical knowledge. It needs someone with the right certifications, the right tools, the right training." Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully, knowing that what she said next would either reach him or drive him further into his defensive shell. "And how's that working for you?" The question hung in the dark room, unanswerable and sharp, cutting through his defenses with the precision of truth spoken in love. Marcus went back to bed but did not sleep, his mind churning through the implications of Sarah's question. In the morning, he looked older than he had the day before, his reflection in the bathroom mirror showing a man being slowly dismantled by something he could not control, could not buy his way out of, could not solve through the application of will and resources. 29 days until the loan payment. The clock kept ticking whether he found an answer or not. Brandon Moore arrived on day 16 with equipment that belonged in a research laboratory rather than a farm field. The kind of technology that seemed almost excessive for diagnosing a tractor, but that Marcus had been assured represented the cutting edge of agricultural machinery diagnostics. The youngest of the mechanics at 34, already building a reputation as the digital generation's answer to old-school diagnostics, the future of farm equipment repair. $400 per hour, but worth it according to 3 different sources, because Brandon solved problems other technicians could not even identify, could see patterns in data that human brains missed, could apply artificial intelligence and machine learning to mechanical failures in ways that were revolutionizing the field. Marcus stood near the barn, watching the young man unload cases of gear with 2 assistants who moved with the careful precision of surgical nurses handling equipment, with the reverence of people who understood its value and fragility. The setup took 40 minutes, creating what looked like a mobile diagnostic center in the middle of his field. Laptop computers networked to sensors that would monitor every system, simultaneously recording data at rates of thousands of samples per second. AI-assisted diagnostics that could process more data in minutes than a human technician could analyze in days. Brandon walked a slow circle around the tractor, not touching it yet, just looking with eyes that saw in systems and algorithms that translated physical reality into data streams and mathematical models. His confidence bordered on arrogance, the certainty of someone young enough to believe they were smarter than everyone who came before, that new tools and new approaches made old knowledge obsolete. But Marcus was past caring about personalities, past caring about whether he liked the people he hired. He needed answers, not bedside manner. "Let's see what the old guys missed." The comment landed like a small insult to the 3 professionals who had failed before him, but Brandon either did not notice or did not care. He plugged his equipment into access ports Marcus had not known existed, connection points that required special adapters and diagnostic modes that were not documented in the standard manuals. 3 hours passed. The wind shifted direction, bringing the smell of distant rain, that particular scent that farmers learn to recognize, that signals weather changes and shifting conditions. Brandon's assistants rotated through breaks, taking turns monitoring the data streams, while the boss analyzed results and ran additional tests based on what the algorithm suggested. James appeared around noon with coffee. Nobody drank, standing at a respectful distance while the young technician worked, watching the process with the quiet skepticism of someone who had seen problems that computers could not solve. Sarah came down from the house mid-afternoon, bringing water bottles and sandwiches nobody had asked for, but that she knew would be needed, bringing the kind of care that went beyond the immediate crisis to the basic human needs everyone was ignoring in pursuit of solutions. When Brandon finally straightened his back and rubbed his eyes, Marcus felt his stomach tighten in anticipation, felt hope and dread mixing together in equal measure. The young man pulled Patricia Anderson's reports from his bag, the comprehensive diagnostics she had run, cross-referenced them with Christopher Clark's notes from day 2. compared both to Daniel Martinez's findings from the hydraulic analysis. He ran his own diagnostics a second time, comparing results against results, looking for discrepancies or patterns that might reveal something the previous technicians had missed. Then a third time, because the consistency of the results bothered him in a way he could not quite articulate. Brandon closed his laptop with the careful deliberation of someone who had reached a conclusion he did not want to share, who had spent hours hoping to find something different and was now facing the reality of failure. He walked over to where Marcus and James stood waiting, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by the troubled expression of someone encountering the limits of their tools and training. "Mr. Drake." Brandon's voice had lost all its earlier confidence, all the cocky certainty he had brought with him. "I'm not going to charge you." The words hung in the cold air, unexpected and somehow worse than any diagnosis could be. "What?" "I can't charge you when I can't tell you what's wrong." Brandon looked genuinely troubled, as if this failure represented something larger than just a broken tractor. "I've analyzed everything, cross-referenced all the data from all 4 diagnostics, run simulations based on every failure mode in the database, used pattern matching algorithms against 10,000 similar machines. All 4 of us, all 4 professionals with different approaches and equipment, have failed to identify the problem." Marcus felt the ground shifting under his feet again, that terrible sensation of certainty crumbling, of systems failing, of reality refusing to conform to expectations. "You're telling me that with all this equipment, all this technology, computers that can process more data than any human, you can't find the problem?" "I'm telling you, it's either hidden in a place none of our systems are designed to look, or it's something so basic, so fundamental, so old school that we're all looking past it because we're trained to look for complex failures that match our complex tools." Brandon paused, struggling with the admission. Modern diagnostics assume problems exist in areas where we can measure things electronically. But if the failure is purely mechanical in a system that predates sensors, our equipment is blind to it. Brandon packed his equipment with movements that spoke of defeat, disguised as efficiency, his assistants helping with unusual silence, none of the casual chatter that had characterized the setup. When everything was secure, when the mobile diagnostic center had been reduced back to cases in the truck, Brandon turned back to Marcus one more time. "Sometimes the machine breaks in a way modern tools can't catch. I hate saying that. It goes against everything I've been trained to believe, everything the industry is moving toward. But it's the truth. There are failure modes that only human experience and mechanical knowledge can detect because they happen in places and ways that we've stopped looking." He refused payment for the hours of work, for the expertise and equipment, because charging for failure felt wrong in a way that transcended business. He drove away, leaving Marcus standing in the gathering dusk, with James beside him, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would make any difference. 16 days. 4 professionals. $10,000 spent on parts and labor and diagnostics that led nowhere, and not a single answer, not even a theory that made sense. That evening, the argument happened the way things do when pressure builds for too long, and something finally has to give when people who love each other reach the breaking point of polite silence and careful restraint. Marcus arrived home after dark to find Sarah in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and an expression that said she had been waiting, that this conversation had been building for days and could not be put off any longer. "James called. He wants to talk to you about something, about someone who might help." Marcus shrugged off his jacket, exhaustion making his movements heavy, making every simple action feel like it required more energy than he had to give. "Not tonight. I can't tonight." "Marcus, you need to listen." Listen to what? The frustration he had been holding back for 16 days finally broke through the careful control, the disciplined restraint that had been costing him more energy than maintaining it was worth. Another opinion I didn't ask for. Another suggestion from someone without the expertise to understand what we're dealing with. I've had 4 certified experts with thousands of dollars in equipment tell me it's impossible to fix. What's James going to add to that? Sarah's voice stayed level, that particular kind of calm that came before storms that signaled she was about to stop protecting his feelings and start telling him truths he needed to hear. "We know someone who might help, someone local, someone with experience that doesn't come from certifications." Marcus felt something snap inside him. The accumulated weight of 16 days and $10,000 and 4 failures, and the loan payment getting closer, compressed into pure frustration that had nowhere else to go. Who another mechanic with another laptop that costs another fortune to accomplish exactly nothing because that's worked out so well so far? No. Sarah set her phone down on the counter with enough force to make it click against the granite. Someone local, someone old school, someone who actually understands machines instead of just reading what computers tell them. The laugh that came out of Marcus's mouth tasted bitter, sharp with sarcasm and fear disguised as contempt. "Old school, Sarah, this is a $95,000 piece of modern engineering, computer-controlled hydraulics, GPS-guided systems. It needs cutting-edge expertise, not some country handyman who learned mechanics in the Stone Age working on equipment that didn't have electrical systems." Sarah crossed her arms, and Marcus recognized the gesture from every serious conversation they had ever had, from every moment when she decided to stop protecting his ego and start telling him truth he needed to hear, even if it hurt. The moment when their marriage shifted from support to challenge, when love meant confrontation rather than comfort. "You know what, I see a man so invested in his system working that he can't admit when it doesn't. A man so certain he knows the right way to solve problems that he can't see the solution standing right in front of him." Her voice was quiet, but sharp, precise, in a way that cut deeper than shouting could. "You've solved every problem in your life by hiring the best person and writing the biggest check. That system built everything we have. I know that. I've watched you do it successfully for 30 years. But this time, that's not working. And instead of trying something different, you're just throwing more money at the same failed approach, expecting different results. What else am I supposed to do?" Marcus heard his voice rising, heard the desperation he had been trying to hide bleeding through. "Just give up. Accept failure. Scrap a machine that's barely a year old because I can't fix it. Maybe ask the person who's been with you from the beginning what he thinks. Maybe trust someone based on experience rather than credentials. James is a foreman, not a mechanic. He manages operations. This needs specialized technical knowledge. Sarah's voice went even quieter, that shift from frustration to something sadder, something that hurt more because it came from a place of deep concern rather than anger. I know this is hard for you. Your whole life you've solved problems by finding the best expert and paying them whatever they ask. That system built our wealth. It put Emma through college. It gave us this life. But maybe this time the answer isn't about credentials or cost. Maybe it's about who actually knows how to listen to what's broken instead of what equipment says is broken. Marcus turned away, staring out the kitchen window, at darkness reflecting back his own face, at his own tired eyes, and the lines of stress that had deepened over the past 2 weeks. Then, what is it about? Maybe it's about who actually listens to the machine instead of the computers, who uses experience instead of algorithms, who knows where problems hide when systems can't see them. He walked to his study without another word, closing the door on Sarah's disappointed expression, shutting himself away from the truth she was offering, because accepting it meant admitting everything he believed might be wrong. But alone in the quiet room, with his files and his spreadsheets and his carefully maintained records of everything he had built, Marcus felt the truth of her words, settling like sediment, heavy and undeniable. 27 days until the loan payment. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Drake did not know what to do next. The next morning, Emma called before sunrise, the phone buzzing on the nightstand, pulling Marcus from restless half-sleep that had never deepened into real rest. The clock showed 5:47. Emma never called this early. "Dad, I'm worried about you." Marcus sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the fog of too little sleep and too much stress. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just some business complications. Mom told me what happened last night, about the argument." Emma's voice carried that particular blend of concern and determination that reminded him so much of Sarah. "I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago but didn't have the courage to say." Marcus was suddenly awake, alert in a way that had nothing to do with coffee or consciousness. "What? You remember when you sold the construction company? When you brought in that CEO from outside Thomas Patterson instead of promoting from within? Emma, that was 15 years ago. What does that have to do with—" "I wanted that job, Dad." Her voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through the careful control. "I had worked there every summer through high school and college. I knew the business. I understood the client relationships. I had ideas about how to expand into residential renovation. But you never asked me. You never even considered it. You just assumed you needed someone with an MBA from a top school and 20 years of experience leading large teams." The words hit Marcus in the chest like a physical blow, driving air from his lungs. "I didn't know you were interested. You never said anything. I thought you wanted to go into marketing. That's why you chose that major." "I chose marketing because you made it clear there was no place for me in the company without the right credentials. Because you told me at dinner one night that modern businesses needed professional management people with proper training, not family members hired out of sentiment." Emma's voice was gentle but firm, delivering truth without cruelty. "You did the same thing you're doing now. You looked for the most credentialed, most expensive solution instead of seeing what was right in front of you. Instead of asking the people who actually knew the business what they thought." "Emma, I was trying to make the best decision for the company's future. I was being responsible." And you know what happened? That CEO you hired, the one with the perfect resume and the MBA from Wharton and all the right credentials, ran the company into the ground in 3 years. He alienated the long-term clients who were the foundation of the business. He implemented systems that destroyed the company culture you'd built. He made decisions based on spreadsheets instead of relationships. She paused, letting that sink in. You had to sell for half what it was worth because you trusted credentials over knowledge, resume over experience. Marcus closed his eyes, the memory sharp and painful even after all these years. He had convinced himself at the time that selling was a strategic move, that the market was changing, and it made sense to exit. But the truth was darker and more personal. Thomas Patterson had made catastrophic decisions, had ignored advice from people who had been with the company for decades, had believed his Ivy League education made him smarter than people who had built their knowledge through years of actual work. Within 18 months, the operation was bleeding money, and client relationships Marcus had nurtured for years were dissolving. By the time Marcus admitted the mistake and tried to intervene, it was too late to salvage more than a fraction of the company's value. What's your point? My point is, you're doing it again. James has been trying to help you for 2 weeks, but you won't listen because he doesn't have the right credentials, because his knowledge comes from experience instead of certifications. Just like you wouldn't listen to me because I didn't have an MBA. Just like you wouldn't listen to the operations managers who tried to warn you about Patterson. She paused. I love you, Dad. But sometimes your strength, your ability to find and hire the best people, becomes your weakness when you can't see that the best person is already there. When you confuse credentials with competence. After she hung up, Marcus sat in the dark bedroom with the phone in his hand and 26 days on the clock, Emma's words echoing in a way that made sleep impossible even if his body was screaming for it. Sarah's voice came soft from beside him, proving she had been awake the whole time listening. She's right, you know. Marcus did not answer. Could not answer. Because he knew they were both right, and admitting it meant admitting his entire system for navigating the world might be fundamentally flawed. That the approach he had relied on for 3 decades, that had built his wealth and his reputation and his sense of self, was not universal. That there were problems it could not solve. Situations where it made things worse instead of better, and that was a truth he was not sure he could bear. But as the sun came up and the 26th day of this crisis began, Marcus Drake was finally broken enough, desperate enough, humble enough to consider that maybe, just maybe, he needed to try something different. Tuesday morning, day 18. James Cooper found Marcus in the barn at first light before the official start of the workday, before the ranch came fully to life with activity and responsibility. The foreman had the expression of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of the reception it received. "Boss, we need to talk." Marcus looked up from the maintenance logs he had been studying for the 100th time, as if staring at records of past successful repairs would somehow reveal the answer to the current failure. "James, if this is about—" "It is, and you're going to listen." James's voice was firm but respectful, that particular combination of deference and determination. "I know someone. His name is Thomas Wright. Lives about 12 miles down County Road 7. He's 71 years old. No fancy certifications. No laptop. No diagnostic equipment. Just a toolbox and 57 years of experience that 4 experts with every advantage couldn't match. Marcus set down the logs, feeling something shift inside him. Some resistance giving way under the accumulated weight of failure and desperation, and the words from Emma and Sarah that he could not unhear. You want me to call a 71-year-old man after 4 certified professionals with tens of thousands of dollars in equipment said it's impossible? Yes, sir, I do. Why? What makes you think he can solve what they couldn't? James had expected this question, had prepared for. It had practiced his answer during the drive to work, but still needed a moment to make sure he got the words exactly right to convey what he knew in a way that Marcus might finally be ready to hear. Because Thomas Wright taught me everything I know about machines. He used to be the lead engineer at Caterpillar's Tennessee plant, designed hydraulic systems for 30 years before he retired, holds patents on hydraulic valve assemblies that are still in use today. He doesn't advertise because he doesn't need to. When the old farmers around here have a problem nobody else can solve, when their regular mechanics give up, when the dealers can't help them, they call Thomas, and Thomas fixes it. Marcus's expression shifted, surprise breaking through the defensive armor, the assumptions about what old school meant. He was an engineer, a designer, one of the best in the industry. Caterpillar offered him a vice president position to stay when he wanted to retire. Turned it down because he said management meant meetings instead of machines. James paused. Then he retired and decided he'd rather fix equipment than design it. Said there was something honest about taking a broken thing and making it work again with your own hands. About solving real problems for real people instead of abstract engineering challenges. Marcus looked past James toward the field where the tractor sat, that green monument to his own limitations and failed assumptions, then back. His voice was quieter now, less defensive. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Why wait until now? James chose honesty over diplomacy, decided that after 18 days and 4 failures, truth mattered more than protecting his boss's ego. Because you never asked what I thought. From day one, you went straight to certified technicians with advanced degrees and expensive equipment. You called Christopher before the first day was over. I figured you wanted that kind of help, professional repair services with official credentials, not the kind Thomas offers, which is wisdom and experience without paperwork to prove it. The truth hung between them, uncomfortable and necessary, like medicine that tastes bitter but heals. Marcus's jaw worked as he processed the implicit criticism, as he confronted the reality that his approach had shut out possibilities before he even knew they existed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of pride, swallowing itself of certainty, crumbling. Will he come? Does he still do this kind of work? I'll call him. He's selective about jobs these days, doesn't need. The money only takes things that interest him or help people he cares about, but I think he'll come if I ask. That afternoon, Marcus sat alone in his study doing calculations that made his chest tight, numbers that refused to add up the way he needed them to. The replacement cost for the tractor if he followed Daniel's advice and scrapped it. The money already spent on repairs and diagnostics that had accomplished nothing. the harvest delay costing him roughly $3,000 per day in lost revenue and increased risk as weather windows closed and market prices fluctuated. Insurance that would cover nothing because the failure had no identifiable cause that met their policy definitions. 25 days until the loan payment was due. 25 days to harvest, process, sell crops at projected yields, and generate the income he had promised the bank based on assumptions that had seemed conservative when he made them, but now looked dangerously optimistic. But the numbers were not what kept him staring at the wall, were not what made his hands shake slightly as he set down his pen. The real cost was harder to quantify, impossible to enter in a spreadsheet. Every assumption about how success worked, how problems got solved, how hiring the right expertise guaranteed results, all of it crumbling under the weight of a machine that refused to cooperate with modern diagnostic technology. The recognition that maybe he did not understand the world as well as he thought he did. That maybe his 30 years of success had been partly luck, partly favorable circumstances, partly the specific problems he happened to encounter, matching the specific solutions he preferred to apply. Sarah appeared in the doorway without knocking, carrying coffee he had not asked for, but needed doing the small acts of care that sustained marriages through difficult seasons. James said Thomas will come tomorrow morning. Marcus took the cup, wrapping his hands around the warmth, using the simple physical sensation to anchor himself. I didn't say yes yet. I didn't authorize it. Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk, the movement casual, but her eyes serious, carrying 32 years of knowing him better than he knew himself. Then I'll say it. Yes. Tell James yes. Stop fighting this. Sarah, I don't even know this person. I'm supposed to trust some 71-year-old mechanic based on James's recommendation after 4 actual experts failed. You trusted 4 strangers based on credentials and online reviews. Why not trust one person based on the recommendation of someone who's worked for you faithfully for 5 years, who's never given you bad advice, who actually knows the man he's recommending? The logic was undeniable, even as everything in Marcus wanted to deny it. Marcus, I've watched you build everything we have, and you know why you succeeded. Not because you had all the answers, but because you were smart enough to recognize when you needed help and brave enough to ask for it. Don't let pride stop you now. Don't let attachment to a system that isn't working prevent you from trying something different. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend his systematic methodology that had never failed before, that had been the foundation of every success he had achieved. But looking at his wife across the desk, seeing the concern in her eyes and the absolute certainty in her expression, most of his resistance crumbled. He picked up his phone and called James, the call connecting after 2 rings. Boss, tell Thomas I'd appreciate him taking a look tomorrow morning if he's available. James's voice carried relief Marcus could hear even through the phone's small speaker emotion that said this meant more to the foreman than Marcus had realized. Yes, sir. I'll let him know right now. Thank you. After he hung up, Marcus sat holding the coffee Sarah had brought and trying to prepare himself for whatever tomorrow would bring, for stepping outside the system that had defined his adult life. Sarah reached across the desk and put her hand over his, her touch warm and firm. This is the right choice. We'll see. But even as he said it, Marcus felt something shift, some small easing of the pressure that had been building for 18 days. That night, he barely slept, mind churning through scenarios and possibilities, and the uncomfortable recognition that he was about to trust his $95,000 problem to someone he had never met, based solely on James's word and his own desperate need for a different approach. Everything in his training, every business instinct he had developed, every successful deal he had ever made said this was foolish, but his training had delivered 4 failures in a row. So maybe foolish was exactly what he needed. Maybe wisdom looked like foolishness when you had been looking at the world from the wrong angle for so long that your eyes had adjusted to the distortion. Wednesday morning, day 19, Marcus stood near the barn at 6:30, watching an old blue Ford truck make its way up the gravel drive, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who knew rushing never made machines work better. The truck was at least 30 years old, maybe older, held together by familiarity and stubbornness, and probably more repairs than original parts, paint faded by decades of Tennessee weather and sun. Thomas Wright climbed out slowly, movements deliberate and careful, working with his body's limitations rather than fighting them. 71 years old, wearing work pants with permanent oil stains and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Gray hair mostly hidden under a faded cap, weathered face that spoke of decades working outside, hands that showed a lifetime of using tools that fought back. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body remembered every hard surface it had ever worked against, every fall and strain and repetitive motion injury accumulated across more than half a century. Marcus walked forward, extending his hand, feeling nervous in a way he had not felt in years, that vulnerability of having no idea whether this was wise or desperate. They shook Thomas's grip, firm but not aggressive, calloused palm, speaking to years of physical labor. Marcus's carrying the tension of 18 days without answers and 24 days until financial consequences he could not fully control. "Mr. Wright, I appreciate you coming. I should tell you up front, 4 certified mechanics with sophisticated diagnostic equipment have already looked at this and—" Thomas cut him off with a gentle shake of his head, a small smile that carried no judgment. "James told me all that. That's exactly why I'm here. When the modern tools don't work, sometimes old knowledge helps." Simple truth delivered without arrogance or drama. No claims of superior ability, just acknowledgement that different approaches solve different problems. "Mind if I take a look?" "Of course, please." Sarah watched from the porch, coffee cup in hand, witnessing this moment she had pushed Marcus toward. She raised her cup slightly when Thomas glanced her way, acknowledgement or encouragement, or both. James stood nearby, hands in his jacket pockets, the quiet confidence of someone who believed in what he had set in motion, who trusted both Thomas's ability and Marcus's capacity to eventually recognize wisdom when it came from unexpected sources. Emma had driven up again from Atlanta without being asked, arriving at dawn, wanting to witness whatever happened next, sensing that this moment mattered in ways that went beyond a broken tractor. She stood slightly apart with her phone ready, wanting to document this for reasons she could not fully articulate. Thomas walked slowly around the machine without touching it yet, without opening panels or checking connections or reaching for tools. Just looking. Not performance, not showmanship, not the confident swagger of experts claiming to know what was wrong before they examined anything. Just the process he had followed for 57 years, whenever confronted with something broken, the discipline of observation before action. The tractor was clean, well maintained. No obvious signs of abuse or neglect, no oil leaks or cracked hoses or visible damage that would explain catastrophic failure. He crouched at the front axle, ignoring the protest from his knees that probably hurt every morning, that probably made getting out of bed an act of will, and stayed there 2 full minutes, studying the undercarriage. Dirt patterns told stories. If you knew their language, revealed how machines moved and stressed and carried weight. Marcus stood 15 feet away with his arms crossed, trying not to watch, but unable to look away, trying not to hope, but unable to suppress it completely. Sarah appeared beside Thomas with a bottle of water, kindness without condescension. "Take your time. No rush." Her voice carried a warmth that Marcus sometimes forgot to show, that reminded him why people liked Sarah in ways they sometimes did not like him. Thomas took the water gratefully, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Appreciated." He climbed into the cab, settling into the seat and reaching for the ignition with hands that had started probably 10,000 machines over the decades. The engine turned over immediately, that deep rumble of a diesel firing on all cylinders, power and health, and absolutely no indication of internal problems. Thomas sat listening, not to the obvious sounds that anyone could hear, but to the small variations underneath, the subtle shifts in tone and rhythm that marked differences between perfect operation and something close enough to fool most ears. 5 minutes with his eyes closed, one hand on the wheel, the other on the control panel, feeling vibrations through metal and plastic, sensing what could not be measured with instruments. The machine was trying to tell him something, sending signals through sound and vibration and response patterns. The message was just buried under layers of apparently correct function hidden beneath systems that all tested optimal. He cut the engine and climbed down, pulling a manual pressure gauge from his toolbox, old-school equipment that required no batteries, that had been measuring hydraulic pressure since before electronic sensors existed, that was simple enough that failure modes were obvious and calibration was visual. Connected it to the main hydraulic line and access port that required knowing where to look because it was not prominently labeled. Fired the engine again briefly, just long enough to get a reading. The pressure came back exactly where it should be, the needle steady in the green zone. Clean. Correct. No fault visible in the primary system. Perfect function according to the only measurement most mechanics would bother taking. Thomas stood beside the machine with one hand resting lightly on the rear panel, not confused exactly, but concentrating in a way that required silence and space, that resisted interruption because the next thought might be the one that mattered. Something here was not adding up. The diagnostic said one thing, 4 different diagnostics from 4 different systems, all saying the same thing. But the machine's behavior said another. And after 57 years, Thomas had learned to trust behavior over data, to believe what machines did rather than what instruments claimed they were doing. Then he said it out loud, mostly to himself, but loud enough that everyone watching could hear. "If everything works, why isn't it moving?" Marcus heard the question, and recognized it from somewhere in the past weeks, some other mechanic asking the same thing, asking what should have been the obvious question from the beginning. But the way Thomas said it was different. Not frustrated, not defeated, not rhetorical. Actually asking, actually building something piece by piece, assembling an answer from questions nobody else had thought to ask in quite this way from this angle with this assumption. Because everyone else had assumed that if diagnostics showed perfect function, the problem must be in some complex interaction of systems, some failure mode so sophisticated that it escaped detection. Thomas was asking what if the problem was exactly where the behavior suggested, in the most obvious place, hidden only by its simplicity. Thomas moved to the left rear side of the tractor, where a small secondary access panel sat low on the frame, partially obscured by the rear wheel housing, positioned in a way that made it awkward to reach. Most mechanics would not check this panel unless primary diagnostics pointed them. They would not even think about it, because modern troubleshooting followed decision trees and checklists that started with complex systems and only examined simple mechanical components as a last resort. It was hard to reach required getting down on one knee in a way that hurt at 71, turning your shoulder sideways to work in the tight space between tire and frame, the kind of place that did not appear on standard service checklists, because systems that deep rarely failed, because modern engineering assumed that if something was buried that deeply, it was reliable enough not to need regular inspection. Rarely, but not never. He pulled a flathead screwdriver and small flashlight from his toolbox, both tools older than most of the men watching, worn smooth from decades of use, shaped by hands and work into extensions of their owner's understanding. Angled the light into the gap between panel and frame, studying what shadows revealed, looking for what should not be there, or what should be there but was not. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that would arrive tonight, whether anyone was ready or not, whether crops needed a few more dry days or not, weather following its own schedule, indifferent to human needs. Marcus had drifted close enough to see over Thomas's shoulder, now arms no longer crossed in defensive skepticism, posture shifting toward something that might have been hope or might have been the exhaustion of having no other options left. James stood beside him, the ranch hands pressed against the fence, watching with the interest of people who had seen the whole 18-day saga unfold. Even Sarah had come down from the porch, standing at a respectful distance, with her hands clasped, bearing witness to whatever was about to happen. Everything quiet, except wind and the distant sound of a door creaking on hinges somewhere, a barn or equipment shed needing oil. Thomas began removing the panel cover, movements slow and careful, not because he was uncertain, but because rushing created mistakes, and mistakes with machines could be expensive or dangerous. Screws set aside in sequence so reassembly would not require guessing or sorting or figuring out which fastener went where. He lifted the cover free and set it in the grass, then leaned in with the flashlight, its beam illuminating spaces that had probably not seen light since this machine was assembled 14 months ago. What he saw confirmed the suspicion that had been building since he first heard the engine run clean, while the machine sat immobile, the incongruity that everyone had noticed but nobody had been able to explain. He reached into his toolbox for a wrench, not asking an assistant to hand it to him, because he worked alone and knew where everything was by feel and habit. Angled his hand into the tight space with the practiced precision of someone who had worked in awkward positions his entire life, who had learned young that machines did not care about human comfort or convenient access angles. Marcus stood directly over Thomas's shoulder, now close enough that the old man could hear his breathing. Change quicken, anticipation building towards something that might finally resemble an answer after 18 days of expensive confusion. For the first time since this crisis began, Marcus Drake felt like something was actually about to happen, like the mystery that had defeated 4 experts and cost him $10,000 was about to be solved by a 71-year-old man with a flashlight and a wrench. Thomas's hand emerged holding a valve no bigger than his palm, smaller than most people would expect, could cause this magnitude of failure. He turned it slowly in the morning light, angling it so the problem became visible even to an untrained eye, so that everyone watching could see what had been invisible to thousands of dollars of diagnostic equipment. The valve was completely clogged. Dense buildup, probably years of accumulated contamination that had finally reached critical mass, had choked off fluid flow to the drive system, while every upstream gauge reported perfect function because they measured pressure before the blockage, not after. Invisible from the outside, impossible to detect by any sensor, because the sensors did not exist in the right places, required thinking about how systems actually worked rather than what instruments measured. The blockage was dense enough that fluid could not pass through at any pressure, choking off the drive system completely. No error code, because the code would only trigger if pressure dropped at measured points, which it did not. No warning light, because warning lights triggered from sensor data that showed everything optimal. No diagnostic alert, because the diagnostic systems were designed to catch complex electronic failures and sophisticated mechanical problems, not simple crud buildup in a secondary valve. The engine ran clean because nothing was wrong with the engine. The hydraulic pressure tested correct because it was correct at every point where pressure was actually measured. The transmission showed no faults because the transmission was fine. The drive system appeared perfect because every component in the drive system was indeed perfect. The entire problem, the catastrophic failure that had cost $10,000 in 18 days and might cost Marcus everything he had built, fit between 2 fingers. Marcus stared at the valve with an expression that cycled through disbelief toward something raw and harder to name. Not anger exactly, though anger was there. Not embarrassment exactly, though embarrassment was there too. Something closer to the particular discomfort a man feels when a belief he has held his entire life, a belief that has defined every major decision and shaped every success, turns out to be catastrophically wrong in front of witnesses who are important to him. He had paid for certainty. 4 separate times from 4 different experts carrying credentials and equipment designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of oversight. Christopher with his John Deere certification, Daniel with his master technician rating, Patricia with her $15,000 diagnostic software, Brandon with his artificial intelligence algorithms, and not one of them had found what a 71-year-old man, located in under an hour, using a flashlight and intuition built from decades of working with machines, that hid their failures in places nobody thought to look, because looking there was awkward and dirty and not on any official checklist. Thomas set the valve carefully on a clean rag from his toolbox, saying nothing about what any of this meant, offering no commentary on the failure of modern diagnostics or the limits of complex systems or the value of experience versus credentials. He simply picked up a small wire brush, its bristles worn from decades of use, worn down to lengths that worked best for this exact kind of cleaning, and got to work. The cleaning process was methodical, patient, the kind of work that could not be rushed without risking damage to the precision-machined passages that had to be perfectly clear for proper function. Working the brush through every passage, each channel, making sure contamination came out completely, rather than just shifting to a different location where it would cause problems later. Flushing the component with clean solvent from a bottle in his kit, liquid carrying away years of accumulated grit and corrosion products and whatever other contamination had worked its way into the system. Working the brush through again after the flush, double-checking, making sure every channel ran clear. Holding the valve up to the morning light, turning it slowly, inspection that required no instruments because the human eye could see what mattered. Checking each passage for remaining obstruction, for any sign that the problem might persist. The satisfaction on his face was quiet, internal, the kind that came from work completed properly rather than praise earned from knowing he had done what was needed in the way it needed to be done. He turned back to the panel and began reassembly with the same patient precision, each component returned to its exact position, because hydraulic systems depended on precise tolerances and proper alignment, each fitting tightened by hand, first to establish the thread and ensure nothing was cross-threaded, then with a wrench to proper torque specified by engineers who understood that over-tightening was as bad as under-tightening. The panel cover went back on. Screws secured in the exact sequence they had been removed, important, because the panel had to seal properly or it would leak or allow contamination. No rushing, no shortcuts, no skipping steps because the watchers were getting restless or because the problem was solved and the rest was just cleanup. Every step mattered because machines repaired carelessly failed again, failed in new and often more expensive ways. Marcus checked his watch without meaning to, the gesture automatic, a habit of measuring time and calculating costs. Realized Thomas had been on the property less than 2 hours, less time than any of the previous 4 mechanics had spent just setting up their equipment, and he had solved what they could not even identify, found what they could not imagine looking for. When everything was reassembled, when every fastener was secure and every connection was proper, Thomas stood slowly brushing dirt from his knee with one weathered hand, working stiffness out of joints that had been bent and stressed in ways they were not designed for at his age. He walked to the cab without a word, without announcement or drama, climbed in with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered every hard surface it had ever worked against, and settled into the seat. The key turned. The engine came alive with that same deep rumble it had produced every time someone tried to start it over, the past 3 weeks healthy and strong and giving no indication it had ever been part of a problem, sounding exactly the way it had sounded for Christopher and Daniel and Patricia and Brandon when they had all climbed into this same seat, expecting different results. Thomas engaged the hydraulic system, letting pressure build through circuits that had been starved for 19 days, that had been trying to push fluid through a completely blocked valve building pressure against an immovable obstacle. He reached for the drive controls with both hands resting calmly on the mechanisms, no tension in his shoulders, no uncertainty in his posture. Then, nothing happened. The tractor sat perfectly still, engine running at idle, all systems engaged, hydraulic pressure supposedly restored, but absolutely no movement in the drivetrain, no response from the wheels, no indication that the repair had worked any better than any of the previous 4 attempts. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it. Not the heavy quiet of something obviously broken, not the frustrated quiet of another expert admitting defeat. This was the silence of a moment balanced on a razor's edge where one outcome would confirm everything and the other would shatter what little hope remained, where Marcus's last option would prove to be just as futile as all the expensive failures that had preceded it. Marcus's jaw tightened, muscles working beneath the skin, his whole body rigid with anticipation and dread. His eyes moved from the tractor to the back of Thomas's head, visible through the cab window, and the corner of his mouth pulled into the faintest involuntary expression. Not quite a smirk, not quite resignation, something in between that communicated, I knew this wouldn't work. I knew better than to hope I knew the old man would fail just like everyone else. James tensed beside him, hands coming out of his pockets, his faith in Thomas suddenly challenged by the same failure that had defined the past 3 weeks. Sarah's clasped hands tightened, knuckles going white, her breath caught somewhere between hope and despair. Emma held her phone steady, recording barely breathing, witnessing the moment when her father's last hope either materialized or evaporated. The ranch hands exchanged glances that communicated disappointment without words that said, "Here we go again. Another failure, might as well get back to work, because this obviously isn't going anywhere." Several had already started to turn away, done watching, convinced they had seen this movie before and knew how it ended. But Thomas Wright did not move, did not react, did not reach for anything or adjust anything or show any sign of concern or confusion or the panic that everyone else was beginning to feel. Did not climb down to check his work or second-guess his repair or wonder if he had made some mistake that invalidated everything. He simply sat in the cab with both hands resting on the controls, completely calm, relaxed even, and waited. Because Thomas knew something 4 certified mechanics and 1 millionaire businessman did not know. In that particular moment, something that came from 57 years of working with hydraulic systems, from understanding not just how they worked in theory, but how they behaved in reality, how they responded after being broken, how they needed time to remember their proper function. Sometimes a machine needs time to remember what it is supposed to do. When a hydraulic circuit has been starved of proper flow for 19 days, when it has been trying and failing to push fluid through a blocked valve, when air has infiltrated lines that should contain only pressurized oil, the system does not recover the instant the blockage is removed. Pressure has to rebuild through the entire network of lines and valves, and actuators has to displace the air that has taken up residence, has to re-establish the continuous column of fluid that translates force into motion. Fluid has to move back into spaces that have been sitting dry or partially dry into actuators that have been starved into cylinders that have been unable to maintain pressure. The process is not complicated. Engineers could explain it in minutes, could draw diagrams showing exactly what happens when hydraulic systems recover from starvation. But it is not instantaneous either. It requires patience. It requires waiting for physics to do what physics does, for pressure to equalize, for air bubbles to work their way out, for systems to purge and pressurize and stabilize. It takes time, not much, but time. 30 seconds maybe, 45. Depends on the system size, the complexity, the length of lines, the volume of actuators. Thomas had seen this before, many times, decades ago on a machine at the Caterpillar plant that everyone wanted to scrap because it would not respond immediately after a hydraulic repair, because the technicians expected instant results and interpreted delay as failure. He had waited then too, had stood calm, while supervisors demanded explanations and engineers questioned his competence, knowing that patience was sometimes the most sophisticated diagnostic tool available, that understanding how machines actually worked in time beat understanding how they worked in theory. That machine had come back to life after 45 seconds and run perfectly for another 8 years before finally being retired for reasons unrelated to hydraulics. So he waited now, counting silently, not looking at his watch because he did not need to, because 57 years had taught him approximately how long this took, because he could feel in the vibrations of the seat and the sound of the hydraulic pump when the system was approaching readiness. While behind him, Marcus Drake held his breath without realizing it, his chest tight, his heart hammering in a way it had not hammered in years, feeling every one of those seconds like individual eternities stretching into an infinite space of uncertainty. While James Cooper trusted in what he knew of Thomas's ability in the years of watching the old man solve problems, others could not, reminding himself that Thomas had never failed him before, had never been wrong about machines, had never promised something he could not deliver. While Sarah Drake hoped with an intensity that surprised her, that went beyond the practical concern about the tractor or even the financial implications, hoped because she wanted her husband to learn the lesson this moment could teach, wanted him to see that wisdom came from unexpected places, and that being wrong about how to solve problems was not failure, but growth. While Emma continued recording, her hands shaking slightly, witnessing the moment when her father's certainty either shattered completely or rebuilt itself on a new foundation, when everything she had said to him about credentials versus knowledge either proved prophetic or became just another daughter's criticism that changed nothing. While the ranch hands began to turn away, convinced this was just another failure in a long string of failures ready to get back to work, that made sense, that produced results that did not involve standing around watching expensive machinery refuse to function. 30 seconds. Longest 30 seconds of Marcus Drake's adult life. Longer than waiting for the biggest deal of his career to close. Longer than sitting in the hospital while Sarah underwent surgery 10 years ago. Longer than anything he could remember, because this 30 seconds contained not just practical consequences, but existential ones, not just the question of whether the tractor would work, but whether everything Marcus believed about competence and expertise in how to navigate the world was fundamentally mistaken. Thomas engaged the controls again, the same controls, the same motion, no adjustment or modification, just the same input that had produced nothing 30 seconds earlier. The tractor moved, slowly at first, hesitant, a low rumble that built into power. The hydraulic system came fully alive, pressure flooding through circuits that had been dormant, pressure suddenly meeting resistance that could move rather than blockage that could not, translating into force and motion the way hydraulic systems were designed to do. Actuators responding with the smooth authority they were engineered to deliver, pistons extending mechanisms, engaging drivetrain, connecting power to wheels. The enormous rear tires, each one worth more than most people's monthly salary, pressed down into Tennessee soil and found their grip, found purchase, began to turn with the ponderous momentum of massive weight beginning to overcome inertia. The whole machine seemed to gather itself, mechanical systems synchronizing into purpose, remembering through the language of pressure and flow and mechanical advantage what they were designed to do, and then it rolled forward across the field. Smooth, steady, strong, purposeful, like it had never been broken at all, like the past 19 days of silence and failure and expensive confusion had been erased in an instant. The ranch hands along the fence went quiet in a way that was different from before, the stunned silence of people watching something they had stopped believing possible, witnessing what looked like a minor miracle, even though it was just hydraulics and physics and knowledge applied correctly. James exhaled slowly, a long breath, carrying 19 days of accumulated tension out into the October air, relief flooding through him, mixed with vindication, because he had been right to trust Thomas, right to push Marcus toward this solution, right to believe that old knowledge could solve new problems. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears starting in her eyes before she could stop them, relief and vindication mixing together in a way that made her chest tight and her throat close. Not just relief that the machine worked, though that mattered, but relief that Marcus had been forced to confront his assumptions, had been humbled in a way that might actually teach him. Something had been shown, that his system was not universal, and that admitting that was not weakness but wisdom. Emma kept recording through her own tears, capturing the moment the massive green machine rolled across the field, capturing her father's face as he watched Thomas Wright do what 4 experts could not, witnessing transformation that went beyond machinery to touch something deeper about pride and humility and being willing to learn. Marcus Drake stood at the edge of the field, watching Thomas Wright drive the $95,000 machine in a wide, steady arc across ground that should have been harvested 2 weeks ago, across soil that had been waiting patiently while humans struggled with problems of their own making. The expression on his face had transformed completely. The defensive skepticism gone, melted away like morning frost under direct sun. The forced confidence stripped away, revealed as the hollow performance it had always been. What remained was something raw and real, something Marcus rarely let anyone see. The look of a man confronting the gap between what he believed and what was actually true, between the world as he had constructed it in his mind and the world as it actually existed. the look of a man being broken and remade in the same moment. Thomas brought the tractor back around, driving the full length of the field, and back again, slow and deliberate, not showboating or celebrating, but checking his work with the respect a craftsman shows, for repairs that matter, for solutions that need to be verified before being declared successful. The engine held strong through the entire run, that deep diesel rumble constant and healthy. No hesitation, no stutter, no hint of the 3 weeks of silence that had preceded this moment. The hydraulics responded cleanly to every input, smooth and certain. The massive tires rolled across the soil with quiet authority, leaving clean tracks in earth that had been waiting too long, finally doing what they were designed to do. When Thomas finally guided the machine back to its original position and cut the engine, the field went silent again. But this silence felt completely different from all the silences before. Not the expensive, oppressive quiet of failure that had hung over this field for 19 days. Not the frustrated quiet of experts admitting defeat. Not the desperate quiet of hope dying. This was the open, clean quiet that settles over a place after a long storm passes, and the air clears, and everything that was bent and battered is still standing, damaged perhaps but not destroyed, tested but not broken. Thomas climbed down from the cab the same way he had climbed up, slowly, carefully, one hand on the rail, both feet finding the ground with the caution of someone who understood that falls at 71 healed differently than falls at 21 or 41, who respected his body's limitations while still asking it to do hard work. He picked up his toolbox from the grass where he had set it, checked that everything was accounted for, that no tools had been left behind or forgotten, and closed the latch with a quiet snap that sounded final and certain. Then he turned around. Marcus Drake was standing 10 feet away, and his whole posture had changed in the past 5 minutes, in the time it had taken for the tractor to roll across the field and back. Not checking his watch, not looking at his phone, not doing any of the things a busy, important man does to signal that his time is valuable, and this interruption has already lasted too long, and there are other matters demanding attention. Just standing there in the middle of his field in the late morning light with an expression that had nothing polished or controlled left in it, all the armor stripped away, all the careful presentation gone. Just a man looking at another man trying to find words for something that did not come easily, for an acknowledgement that cost more than money because it cost pride. What happened next said more about Marcus Drake than anything else in this story, revealed more about his character than 30 years of business success ever had. Because a man's character is not shown in his successes, which anyone can achieve with enough money and favorable circumstances and good timing. Character shows in how he handles being completely, publicly wrong in front of people whose opinions matter to him, in front of people he has to see again tomorrow and the day after. Marcus walked forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps, and extended his hand. Not the brisk, transactional handshake from that morning when Thomas had arrived, the minimal civility extended to service providers. This one was slower, more deliberate, held longer. The kind of handshake that means something beyond greeting or deal closing or social obligation. The kind that acknowledges respect and relationship and something changing between two people. "Mr. Wright, I owe you an apology." Thomas listened without surprise, without satisfaction either, without any of the smugness that lesser men might have shown in his position. Just quiet attention to words that clearly needed saying, that mattered to the person saying them. "When James told me about you, I didn't take it seriously. I want to be straight with you about that." Marcus's voice was steady, but cost him something to keep that way. "I looked at your truck pulling in this morning, and I had already decided in my mind this wasn't going to work. I had already judged you based on appearance and age, and the fact that you didn't arrive with a service van full of diagnostic equipment. That wasn't right, and I'm sorry for it." The ranch hands had gone very still, witnessing something they understood was more significant than a fixed machine, more important than a solved problem. Their boss, who never admitted fault, who never showed weakness, who maintained control and certainty at all times, standing in the dirt, apologizing to an old mechanic. James stood off to the side with his hands back in his jacket pockets, his expression unchanged, but his eyes bright. The look of a man seeing something he had believed in get confirmed, seeing his judgment validated in a way that mattered beyond the practical outcome. Emma lowered her phone, no longer recording, understanding that some moments were meant to be experienced rather than documented, that bearing witness meant being present rather than capturing. Sarah had tears running down her face now, not bothering to wipe them away. Not from the relief of the tractor being fixed, though that relief was real, but from watching her husband do something she had been waiting years to see, watching him admit he was wrong without qualifying it, without defending himself, without protecting his ego, just owning it cleanly. Thomas was quiet for a moment, letting the apology settle, letting Marcus feel the weight of what he had said. Then nodded once, the kind of nod that accepts something without making more of it than it needs to be, that acknowledges the cost and honors it, but does not demand further payment. Appreciate that. Two words that closed the account cleanly and moved things forward without lingering in discomfort or demanding additional penance. But Marcus was not finished. He let go of Thomas's hand but did not step back, did not break the moment. Took a slow breath, looked back at the tractor for a moment, that green machine that had become so much more than just equipment, then turned to face the man who had solved in 2 hours what 4 professionals could not solve in 3 weeks. "I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer." Thomas waited, gray eyes steady and patient, comfortable with silence, in a way that suggested he had nothing to prove and no need to fill space with unnecessary words. "How long have you known machines like this one?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, doing the quiet math, accessing memories that stretched back more than half a century. "Started working on farm equipment when I was about 14, helped my uncle with his operation, so 57 years give or take." Marcus nodded slowly, trying to comprehend that half-century of accumulated knowledge, trying to imagine what that depth of experience actually meant. "Those 4 mechanics I hired before you, Christopher, Daniel, Patricia, Brandon. Good equipment, proper training, every certification you're supposed to have, hundreds of thousands of dollars in diagnostic tools between them." He paused, and the question that followed carried real weight, real confusion. How did they miss something that simple? Thomas was quiet for a moment, not because he lacked an answer, but because he was choosing how to say it honestly without being cruel, how to tell the truth without insulting people who had done their best with what they knew. They did good work with the tools they had. They looked at what the machine was telling them through their equipment. Computers give you data. Data points you somewhere. You follow the data. You find what the data points to. That's what they're trained to do, and it works most of the time. He paused, making sure Marcus was really listening, really hearing. But sometimes the problem isn't where the data points. Sometimes it's in the places nobody thinks to check, because they're not on any list, not monitored by any sensor, not part of any diagnostic tree. Places that only matter if you know they exist, and why they exist, and how they can fail. Marcus absorbed that understanding, spreading across his face like cold water, uncomfortable but clarifying. Thomas continued, his voice carrying no judgment, just truth delivered plainly. Those four mechanics knew what their training taught them, what their equipment could detect, what the manufacturer's troubleshooting guides told them to check. I knew what people usually don't check, what gets overlooked because it's awkward to reach or because it fails so rarely that nobody thinks about it until it does fail. That's not the same thing as being smarter. It's just different years, different kind of knowledge built different ways. The wisdom in those words hit Marcus with unexpected force, reframed everything he had been thinking about: expertise and competence and value. Different years, different knowledge, not better or worse, not superior or inferior, just different approaches that solved different problems, that saw different things, that had value in different contexts. Marcus looked at Thomas Wright for a long moment, really seeing him for the first time instead of seeing his assumptions about age and credentials and what an expert should look like. Then made a decision with the same clean directness that had served him well in every area of life where he trusted his instincts over his systems. I'd like to offer you a position, permanent, 3 days a week or however many you're willing to work, your own hours within reason, fair pay, and I mean genuinely fair, not what I think sounds fair. You tell me what your time is worth, and that's what we'll agree on. Thomas studied him with those steady gray eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by offers of money or the performance of generosity that could tell the difference between someone trying to buy their way out of embarrassment and someone making a genuine offer. You don't need a full-time mechanic. You got James in regular service contracts. Marcus shook his head, certainty in his voice. No. I need someone who actually knows what they're doing, someone who can teach James what the certification programs don't teach, someone who can look at a problem from angles I don't know exist. There's a difference between hiring another service provider and bringing in someone who can change how we think about maintenance and equipment and problem solving. Something moved behind Thomas's expression. Not quite a smile, but the quiet recognition of being seen clearly after a long time of being underestimated or dismissed, of having his knowledge valued for what it actually was, rather than dismissed for what it lacked on paper. He looked out across the field at the tractor sitting ready for work again, at the crops waiting to be harvested, at the land being worked and cared for, then back at Marcus. I'll think on it. Need to consider whether I want to commit to regular work again, but I appreciate the offer, and I'll give it serious thought. That's all I'm asking. Take whatever time you need. Sarah approached them, crossing the field with purpose, and extended her hand to Thomas before Marcus could make proper introductions. Mr. Wright, I'm Sarah Drake. Thank you for what you did today." Thomas took her hand with the particular gentleness older men show for women they respect, that comes from a different era's understanding of courtesy. "Ma'am, I just did what needed doing. Glad it worked out." Sarah's voice carried weight when she spoke next, emotion barely controlled. "You did what 4 men with expensive equipment couldn't do. That matters. But more importantly, you taught my husband something he needed to learn, something I've been trying to teach him for years. That matters even more." Marcus did not argue, which was itself an argument for how much had shifted in the past 2 hours, how fundamentally his worldview had been challenged. Sarah turned to her husband, her tone gentler now, pride and love mixing together. "I'm proud of you." Marcus's expression was confused, almost hurt. For what? Being wrong for 3 weeks, wasting $10,000. For being willing to admit it, for being humble enough to ask for help from someone you had already dismissed, for learning something that challenged everything you believed about how to solve problems. The words landed soft, but carried more weight than criticism would have. Acknowledged the difficulty of what Marcus had done in a way that made it feel like growth rather than failure. Marcus looked at his wife with something like gratitude mixing with exhaustion, then turned to where James stood watching from a careful distance, witnessing but not intruding. "James." The foreman came closer, hands coming out of his pockets. "I owe you an apology too." James started to speak to wave it off, but Marcus held up a hand. "No, let me say this. You tried to tell me, multiple times. I didn't listen. I dismissed your opinion because you're the foreman rather than a certified mechanic, because your knowledge comes from experience rather than training programs." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence honestly, without exposing more than he wanted to admit in front of everyone. James finished it for him, no bitterness in his voice, just stating a fact they both knew to be true. Because credentials matter more than knowledge, because paper matters more than practice. That's not fair to you. You know this land, these machines, the people who work here, the reality of how things actually function rather than how manuals say they should function. I should have asked you first. I should have trusted your judgment before calling strangers." James nodded, accepting the apology with the same straightforward grace he brought to everything, without making a big deal of it or extracting additional concessions. "Appreciate that, boss." Marcus's voice carried new resolve, the sound of a man making a commitment he intended to keep that cost him something to make because it contradicted decades of habit. "From now on, when we have a problem, I'm asking you before I call anyone else, before I hire experts or bring in consultants or spend money on solutions that might not fit. Your judgment matters, and I'm going to treat it that way. Deal?" James smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face, relief and validation mixing together. "Deal." Emma came over, then putting her phone away, completely finished with documentation. She hugged her father without saying anything, held him tight, and Marcus understood without words being spoken that she had witnessed something important, that the lesson was not just about a tractor or a valve or hiring the right person. It was about being humble enough to admit when your system stops working, when the beliefs you built your life on need to be examined and maybe rebuilt from the ground up, when being wrong is not failure, but the beginning of wisdom. When they separated, Emma looked at Thomas with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Wright, for taking the time, for having patience with my father." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners the closest he came to a smile. "Happy to help, miss. Machines are easier to fix than people, but sometimes fixing the machine helps fix the people too." The wisdom in that simple statement hit everyone differently, meant something different to each person who heard it, but resonated with truth that went beyond machinery. "I hope you say yes to my dad's offer. I think he needs someone like you around. We all do." Thomas nodded slightly. "We'll see. Gotta think on whether I'm ready to commit to regular work again, but I appreciate the sentiment." The group began to disperse, the crisis, resolved normal life resuming, but everyone understanding that something had changed, that this was not just about a repaired tractor, but about relationships and assumptions and how people navigate the world. The harvest ran through the rest of that week without interruption, equipment moving across fields with the efficiency of systems functioning as designed. Marcus watched from his office window as the work progressed, as machines that should have been working 3 weeks ago finally did their jobs, as crops came in and were processed and prepared for market. The yields were not great, reduced by the delay and the weather complications that had accumulated, but they were good enough to make the loan payment with a small margin to spare, good enough to avoid catastrophe. He slept better than he had in weeks. Real sleep rather than exhausted collapse, though his mind kept circling back to Thomas's words about where systems hide their failures, about the difference between data and knowledge, about how the most expensive solution is not always the best one. 1 week later, Thomas Wright called Marcus's cell phone just after sunrise, the phone buzzing on the nightstand where Marcus had finally stopped keeping it on silent at night, where he could afford to relax slightly, knowing that the immediate crisis had passed. "Mr. Drake been thinking on your offer." Marcus sat up immediately, fully awake, despite the early hour anticipation tightening in his chest. "And I'll take it. Part-time, like you said, 3 days a week, and I want to train James proper. Boy's got good instincts, good hands, good understanding of how things work. But he needs someone to teach him what the certification programs don't cover, what you learn from doing rather than studying. If I'm going to commit time to this, I want to know the knowledge continues after I'm gone." Marcus felt something unknot in his chest that had been tight since the morning the tractor died, relief flooding through him, mixed with something that felt like hope for a different kind of future. "Done. Absolutely. When can you start?" "How about tomorrow? Might as well begin while the weather's still decent and there's work to be done." The next morning, Thomas arrived in his blue Ford truck to find Marcus, James, and Sarah waiting near the barn in the cold morning air. Emma had driven up from Atlanta again specifically for this, arriving before dawn, wanting to witness the beginning of whatever this would become. She stood slightly apart from her parents with the camera on her phone ready, wanting to document a moment she suspected would matter later, that would become part of family history. They made a small celebration of it, informal and genuine. Coffee and pastries Sarah had driven into town to buy from the bakery that opened at 5, hospitality and welcome that went beyond business to something more personal. Welcoming Thomas, not just as an employee or contractor or service provider, but as something more difficult to name. A teacher, maybe. a mentor, a reminder, someone whose presence would change how things operated here in ways that went beyond mechanical repairs to touch something deeper about wisdom and humility and staying open to learning. Thomas set his toolbox in the newly cleaned maintenance shop Marcus had spent 2 full days preparing, clearing out accumulated junk and organizing properly, installing better lighting and a proper workbench, creating space that showed respect for the work that would happen here. The space organized with care, with attention to what someone working with tools would actually need, rather than what looked impressive. James showed him around with visible enthusiasm, the younger man's respect for the older, evident in every gesture and word, in the way he listened and asked questions and soaked up everything Thomas said. 2 men separated by almost 30 years by different eras and different approaches to learning, but connected by understanding machines in ways that went beyond what manuals could teach, by knowing that some knowledge lived in hands and experience rather than books and certifications. Marcus watched from the doorway, Sarah beside him, and felt the rightness of this settling into place, felt something that had been wrong for longer than just 3 weeks beginning to correct itself. "You did good," Sarah said quietly, her hand finding his. Marcus looked at his wife, seeing the pride in her expression, hearing the relief in her voice. "We'll see. It's just beginning. It feels right, though." "Yeah, it does." Later that afternoon, after Thomas and James had left to inspect the irrigation system in the north field, to begin the work of maintaining equipment before it broke, rather than fixing it, after Marcus sat alone in his study with a notepad, something he had not used in years, preferring digital systems and organized files to handwritten notes. But some things needed to be written by hand, needed the physical act of forming letters to help them sink in properly. He wrote 3 words at the top of the page: "Look past obvious." Underneath, he started a list of questions, the kind he should have been asking long before a broken tractor forced the issue, the kind that might prevent future crises, or at least help him navigate them differently when they came. What is the problem actually asking for before deciding what it needs? Experience versus credentials. Which matters more in this specific situation? Where does real knowledge about this particular issue actually live? Am I looking in the right places or just the familiar places? Who am I not listening to, and why am I not listening to them? What assumptions am I making that might be wrong? What worked in the past that might not work now? Who around me has wisdom I'm missing because I'm not asking the right questions? 19 days and $10,000 to learn something. A 71-year-old man in worn work clothes had known his entire life, had learned so deeply, it had become instinct, had applied so naturally, it looked simple, even though it represented decades of accumulated wisdom. The best answer is not always the most expensive one. The most credentialed voice in the room is not always the most knowledgeable. The solution you are searching for is sometimes in the place nobody wanted to look, because looking there was uncomfortable or awkward or not on any official list. And admitting you were wrong, truly wrong about fundamental assumptions was not weakness, but the beginning of actual wisdom. Sarah appeared in the doorway without knocking, a habit of 32 years of marriage. "You look thoughtful." Marcus held up the notepad. "Just making sure I don't forget. Writing it down so it stays real instead of becoming just another story I tell myself about a problem I solved." "You won't forget. This kind of lesson sticks. It cost you too much not to remember it." That afternoon, Thomas and James worked on equipment together, the kind of preventive maintenance that saved money in the long run, but required knowledge to know what to look for, where machines would fail before they actually failed. Thomas turned every task into a teaching moment, showing James not just how to do things, but why they were done that way. What signs to watch for, what sounds meant trouble, where to look when everything seemed fine but something felt wrong. Diagnostics tell you what's wrong with the system, Thomas explained, his hands moving over hydraulic lines, feeling for heat and vibration and subtle wrongness that instruments would never detect. Experience tells you where to look when the system lies, when the numbers say one thing but the machine says another. James absorbed every word, taking mental notes, asking questions that showed he understood this was not just about fixing this specific piece of equipment, but about learning a way of thinking, a way of understanding machines that went beyond technical specifications to something more intuitive and harder to define. Marcus brought coffee mid-afternoon, finding them deep in discussion about hydraulic theory that went over his head but clearly fascinated them both, that connected principles Thomas had learned, designing systems at Caterpillar with practical applications James encountered every day. "How's it going?" Thomas looked up from the combine they were inspecting, grease on his hands and satisfaction in his expression. "Good. James here's a natural. Has the right kind of mind for this work. Shame nobody taught him properly earlier, but we'll fix that." James's voice carried genuine affection mixed with respect. "Had to wait for the right teacher." Emma found her father in his office that evening, paperwork spread across his desk, but his attention clearly somewhere else, his mind working on things that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or contracts. She knocked on the door frame even though the door was open, waiting for him to look up. "Dad, can I tell you something?" Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where so many important conversations had happened over the years. Always. Emma sat choosing her words with care, wanting to get this right. "I've watched you my whole life. Watched you build everything from nothing. Watched you solve problems nobody else could solve. Watched you create wealth and opportunities and all of this." She gestured at the office, the house beyond it, the life they had built. "But today was the first time I saw you admit you didn't know something and ask for help from someone you had initially dismissed. That made me really proud. Prouder than any business success ever did." Marcus felt his eyes water, emotion rising, unexpected and powerful, breaking through defenses that usually kept such feelings contained. "Took me 62 years and a broken tractor." Emma laughed, the sound genuine and warm, filling the office with something that felt like healing. "Better late than never. Some people never learn it at all." "You know what the hardest part was?" "What?" "Realizing that the system I built my entire life on, find the best expert and pay them, and trust their expertise and the problem gets solved, that it wasn't wrong exactly. It just wasn't complete. It works for some problems, but not all problems. Sometimes the best expert is the one nobody thinks to call because they don't fit the expected profile. Emma reached across the desk and put her hand over her father's contact that conveyed more than words could. "You're going to be okay, Dad. Better than okay. This is growth, not failure. Doesn't always feel like growth. The best growth rarely does. It's usually uncomfortable and challenging and makes you question everything. But that's how you know it's real." 3 months later, the ranch had its best harvest in 5 years, the kind of yield that made agricultural journals take notice and neighbors ask questions about methodology and timing and what Marcus was doing differently. The answer was complicated, involved many factors beyond just having working equipment, but part of it was the systematic preventive maintenance Thomas had implemented, the early detection of problems before they became catastrophic, the kind of attention to machinery that came from actually understanding how it worked, rather than just reacting when it broke. Thomas came 3 days a week like clockwork, Tuesday through Thursday, working with James on everything from combines to irrigation systems to the smaller equipment that never got enough attention until it failed. Taught constantly, patiently, generously sharing knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating, passing it to someone who would carry it forward. The John Deere 9R ran perfectly. No hiccups, no mysteries, no repeats of the catastrophic failure that had brought them all to this point. Just reliable operation the way a 14-month-old machine should perform when properly maintained by people who understood what they were looking at. Marcus stood in the barn one cold December afternoon, frost on the ground outside, and his breath visible in the unheated space, watching Thomas teach James about transmission systems, knowledge flowing from one generation to the next in a way that would have been impossible in a classroom or certification program. Marcus realized in that moment what he had actually hired, what he had actually brought into his operation and his life. Not just a mechanic, though. Thomas was an excellent mechanic. Not just expertise, though. Thomas certainly had that. He had brought in a mentor, a teacher, a living reminder that wisdom does not always come with a price tag, that the best solutions are sometimes the simplest ones, discovered in the most unlikely places, and that being willing to admit you are wrong opens the door to actually being right in ways you could never achieve while clinging to certainty. Thomas finished explaining something about gear ratios and stress points and noticed Marcus watching from the doorway. "Something you need, boss?" Marcus shook his head, the title still feeling strange coming from a man he had nearly dismissed based on appearance alone, based on assumptions about what expertise looked like. "Just wanted to say thank you for that day, for saying yes to this arrangement, for everything you're teaching, James, for what you taught me without meaning to." Thomas's voice was matter-of-fact, carrying no false modesty, but also no pride, just simple honesty. "Nothing to thank me for. I get to work with my hands pass on what I know to someone who'll use it well. That's payment enough. Better than money, honestly. Money just sits in a bank. Knowledge in the right hands changes things." That evening, Marcus sat on the porch with Sarah despite the cold. Both of them wrapped in blankets, coffee steaming in the winter air, comfortable silence between them that spoke of 32 years of learning how to be together. "You look happy," Sarah said after a while. Marcus took the coffee she offered, holding the warm cup in both hands. I am. You know why? Tell me. Because I finally learned what I should have known all along, that the most valuable things in life, wisdom and experience and truth, they don't come with certifications or business cards or expensive equipment. They come from people willing to get their hands dirty and look where others won't. They come from experience accumulated over years of actually doing the work instead of just studying it. They come from being humble enough to learn from anyone, regardless of what their resume looks like. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her presence warm and steady and familiar in the best way. Took you long enough? Marcus laughed, the sound carrying genuine joy, the kind that comes from having survived something difficult and come out changed for the better. Yeah, it did. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over fields that had nearly cost Marcus everything, but had instead taught him something more valuable than any business deal or real estate transaction ever had. Real knowledge does not come with a price tag. The most powerful solutions are almost always the simplest ones, hidden in places most people do not look, because looking there requires humility and open-mindedness and willingness to challenge your own assumptions about how the world works. And the person with the answer you need might be driving an old truck, wearing worn clothes, and waiting for someone to finally ask them, instead of dismissing them based on surface appearances and credential expectations. Marcus Drake learned this lesson the hard way. 4 professionals with impeccable credentials, 19 days of mounting desperation, $10,000 spent on expertise that failed to deliver. And the answer was there the whole time, 12 miles down County Road 7, in the hands of a 71-year-old man who nobody took seriously until they had no other choice, who solved with wisdom and experience what expensive technology could not detect. So here is the question, worth sitting with, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges you face. What problem are you facing right now where you have only been checking the obvious places, only consulting the expected experts, only looking where conventional wisdom says to look? What solution might be waiting in the uncomfortable spot nobody has bothered to reach into yet, in the place that does not appear on any official checklist or diagnostic tree? And whose knowledge have you underestimated simply because it did not arrive with the right title, or the right price tag, or the right credentials? Because somewhere out there is a Thomas Wright who already knows the answer to your problem. The only question is whether you will call him before or after you have run out of expensive options, before or after you have exhausted every conventional approach, before or after you have been humbled enough to look beyond your assumptions about what expertise looks like.